name is Anita Ramasastry. I'm a professor of law at the University of Washington, but here today in my capacity as the special representative to the Chair-in-Office, currently Poland, of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. We have several different experts who are going to provide different perspectives today on the concept of return of assets, so asset recovery, but return of assets in the public interest. And within the OSCE, we have been referring to this as the concept of social reuse. So we'll be focusing on what that means from the perspective of civil society. So we'll look at how social reuse works and the purpose and actually the kind of intent. And then we'll actually get into looking at the technicalities of this, the challenge of international asset recovery and return, what it looks like, and then end with some case studies. So I think this will be a rich discussion, and we look forward to your questions and input as well. It is my pleasure, though, to begin this morning with opening remarks from Ambassador Igli Hasani, who is the chair of the Office of the Coordinator of Economic and Environmental Activities at the OSCE, and this is where the actual work and implementation of anti-corruption projects takes place. So welcome, Ambassador Hasani.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Anita. Thank you, Professor Ramasastry. I hope my microphone will work, or I'll try to corrupt it by being a bit louder, and it works.
Okay.
And good morning to all of you. Needless to say, at this conference, corruption constitutes a major governance challenge in today's world. It undermines democratic institutions and the rule of law and public trust, and it slows investment and economic development. It endangers the stability and security of societies and undermines the values of democracy. I'll aim in my presentation to give you some background on the work of the OSCE in combating corruption through strengthening asset recovery efforts in the region, and put into context how some recent developments in asset recovery, especially in Europe, for example, the most recent decision of the Council of the EU criminalizing restrictive measures, can build on OSCE efforts to further enhance the impact of national governments and international organizations in combating high-level corruption and transnational organized crime. Spanning through 3 continents with 57 participating states from Europe, Central Asia, and America, the OSCE is the world's largest regional security organization. It works to enhance security and stability by promoting international cooperation on economic issues, strengthening good governance, and assisting its participating states in combating corruption and, of course, money laundering. The OSCE participating states have granted the organization a strong mandate in this area. Since 2003, the OSCE strategy document for the economic and environmental dimension committed the participating states to close cooperation on economic, good governance, and sustainable development issues. The 2012 OSCE Dublin Declaration provides strong political support for a comprehensive approach to securing good governance and transparency and combating corruption and money laundering. But most importantly, it gave to the organization a new mandate to support its members in implementing their international asset recovery commitments. And only 2 years later, in 2014, the Basel Ministerial Council decision emphasized this by encouraging its members to facilitate the recovery of stolen assets as part of national measures, as well as in the framework of international and, when appropriate, regional cooperation, and to ensure also beneficial ownership transparency. This emphasis recognizes that asset recovery is one of the most powerful tools in combating corruption and illicit finance. Grand-scale corruption and flows of stolen and laundered money through the international financial system can have a devastating impact on the economic and political development of all countries, but especially developing ones that lack strong institutions and the rule of law to prevent corruption, prosecute cases efficiently, and recover assets. Failure to recover stolen assets results in the reduction of funds available for public spending, undermines confidence in public institutions, taints financial and banking systems, damages private sector trust in investment and business conditions, and if long-lasting can lead to severe public outcry and conflict, undermining not only national stability, but also affecting the stability of neighboring countries and regions. High-level money laundering and increasingly sophisticated corruption cases frequently expose extensive public corruption and urge us to make additional efforts in building strong political and technical cooperation, including in and among the OSCE participating states. The technical expertise and working international cooperation is necessary to return stolen assets to their country of origin, and it can only be successful when grounded in solid legislation, effective enforcement, and high-level political will. This is where the activities supported by the OSCE in cooperation with other international organizations aim to have an impact. We have supported a variety of projects and initiatives that have aimed to strengthen regional cooperation in asset recovery since the 2012 Dublin Declaration and the Basel decision of 2014 that I mentioned earlier. The OSCE participating states have continued to reiterate their support for our work in this area, and most recently in 2020 with the Tirana Ministerial Council decision on preventing and combating corruption through, among others, the effective implementation of asset recovery measures and improved international and regional cooperation in this regard. Through successful asset recovery efforts, we're combating corruption and giving back to societies what have been stolen from them. Asset recovery also serves an important function in the fight against crime and especially organized crime. Such efforts ensure that the illicit proceeds are removed and recovered from criminal organizations and can contribute to the dismantling of these entities. Another extremely important potential benefit of asset recovery is to the state. Confiscated assets can be used for the compensation of victims and used also for the development of the economy or to further other public policies. The OSCE initiatives on asset recovery in Southeast Europe now have expanded to the rest of the OSCE region with particular focus as well as in Moldova and Ukraine. And in the last 3 years, we have engaged intensively with all relevant national authorities, supporting capacity building and cooperation through the entire cycle of asset recovery, law enforcement, judiciary, asset management agencies. But most importantly, we have engaged with civil society organizations to enhance their knowledge and ensure their successful input and involvement in the social reuse of confiscated assets. Building on the experience of other OSCE participating states, especially Italy, but also Spain, France, Belgium, and many others, we have empowered civil society to be a key part in bringing back to societies what have been stolen from them. During the conceptualization of this initiative and its implementation, it has been clear to us that only through close and effective collaboration between government authorities, especially asset management agencies and civil society organizations, can social reuse of confiscated assets be successful. Only through comprehensive government efforts can asset recovery processes be successful, and to ensure all that possibility of success, governments need to institute and implement realistic national asset recovery strategies, as well as multi-agency bodies to oversee the distribution of assets and frequently review asset reuse policies to measure the effectiveness. In beneficiary countries, which are still in the process of establishing rules and procedures to effectively implement social reuse, we're working closely with civil society organizations to raise awareness on social reuse processes and enable them to work closely with government authorities. If I may for a moment remove the hat of the OSCE coordinator and be the Albanian among many others in this room, I'm proud to say that my home country in recent years have instituted a coordination body whose responsibility is to allocate confiscated assets, balancing wealth support to law enforcement agencies, but also support to affected communities in line with the national legislative framework. This approach has so far enabled a well-planned and organized distribution of assets, seeing results and sustaining the effectiveness of the asset recovery cycle. Long-term results remain to be seen, but we are optimistic, and we're using this experience as a model for states in the region that lack a coordination body to effectively allocate confiscated assets. Also, in recent years, with the help of the international community, a coordination body for civil society organizations, the Partners of Albania, has been created to help in cases of social reuse. It has been a key connector between the government and civil society organizations, and the OSCE is currently working to replicate this practice in the region, as well as to empower civil society in the fight against crime and corruption. In closing, I would like to thank the other speakers that will take the floor after me for their current and future contributions to the OSCE work in asset recovery. Libera has been a close partner throughout our comprehensive asset recovery initiative in Southeast Europe in the last 3 years, and we continue to be inspired by their work and experience. We have benefited immensely from the experience and knowledge also of our colleagues at the Basel Institute on Governance in improving asset recovery mechanisms and learning from best practices in the confiscation, management, and reuse of assets. But also I'd like to thank the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime on empowering civil society to be involved in bringing back to communities what was stolen from them by crime and corruption. And I'd like to thank Professor Ramasastry for her contribution to the project, intellectual support, and giving it the visibility it deserves. And last but not least, the US and UK governments for their continued support in these efforts. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hasani. I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the project that Ambassador Hasani mentioned, which has been supported by the United States and the UK governments, which is focused on asset recovery, but really talk about why did we give this panel the title, Who Gets the Mansions and the Yachts, and what's, I think, very unique about this particular project. I want to mention that in the audience is Iris Pilika. She can maybe raise her hand, who has been managing the project for the OSCE, because there are some resources that I think for those of you in this room who are interested in this concept of the last mile, right? When you have recovery, if it is actually going to be for the public benefit for communities or for this idea of social reuse, how do you make that happen? And that's where I think the OSCE is really engaged in some innovative work, and I'll just tell you about it briefly and then we'll hear from our panelists. The project that is underway now, and it's in its second phase, focuses on 3 key areas. One, which we talk a lot about at conferences, which is the financial investigations, asset seizure, and confiscation. So that front-end piece, and we're going to hear more about some of that from Gretta Fenner from the Basel Institute. But the other 2 pieces, which are I think, less explored, is asset management and asset reuse. And so this current project is really focusing on those issues. So I'm not going to talk about seizure and confiscation, but I'm just going to mention that the OSCE has been pioneering work in the efficiency and effective role of asset managers, focusing currently on the Balkans with a network called BAMN, the Balkan Asset Management Network. But that network is growing by the day. So it has a secretariat, and new governments are joining at any time. So asset managers are the people that actually manage things like a seized yacht, a seized company, real property, as well as fiscal assets, bank accounts, et cetera. And the intricacies of asset management, of how you maintain the assets, how you dispose of the assets, and then where the proceeds go, are incredibly challenging and complex issues. But one which I hope you will all go away and realize that less, I think, investment has been put in the past. So the OSCE's work in creating this network of professional asset managers and developing good practice, I think, is very, very important. And so asset management agencies are really key, and one of the things the OSCE has been doing is really working on what partnerships look like between the asset managers as well as with civil society groups in terms of developing processes for this public distribution of those seized assets. So that's just one thing to say. And again, we have a webinar which I'll post a link to, but there's been really good work done around really challenging issues of, again, if you have a company that's being seized, how does that return to a building? What does it mean to give back a building to the community that's going to be used in a sustainable manner? There are just many, many challenges. So that's one piece I think that's important. The second project component, or I should say third, but one I'll talk about very briefly, is increasing public engagement in the prevention and fight of organized crime and corruption, but using the concept of social reuse of confiscated assets as part of building community trust and sort of rebuilding societies that have been impacted by corruption and organized crime. And so this part of the project is focused on civil society and policymakers and pushing for good public policies, as Ambassador Hasani mentioned Albania, that promote this idea of asset reuse for social purposes. So there's a policy-making piece as well as then building awareness of how to reinvest in local economies. And I'm really pleased that you're going to hear from Libera today, who has supported these efforts in raising awareness among civil society groups about Italy's pioneering experience in bringing back to communities assets that were confiscated in relation to the mafia. So Libera is kind of a model and brings decades-long experience, but we've been really working with Libera to bring that knowledge to civil society groups in the Balkans and elsewhere. And so the last thing I'll just mention is that we will be launching shortly, not we, but the OSCE, a paper that focuses on policy options. So if we think about, again, the idea of social reuse and also sort of how to efficiently return assets, there is a policy paper that is based on speaking to experts in the region where there will be 18 key recommendations on how to better repurpose different kinds of assets. So again, back to mansions, back to yachts, back to these different classes of assets, and how to improve regional cooperation in the return and reuse of those assets. And so again, the idea here is that there is a great resource here. So asset management networks, civil society empowerment, and then recommendations back to governments and law enforcement on sort of how to do this all well. So I'm going to conclude here because, again, we want to hear from our experts, but just to say, I really hope that you'll take away the fact that these are two really, really important areas that the OSCE and other partners are creating public resources to help better equip us all to deal with these challenges. And if you are interested in the resources that we are preparing, please just at the end of the panel, make sure to give us your card and we'll make sure that you are aware of the new guides and materials that are coming out. So thank you so much, and with that, we will turn to our first panelist, and that is, as we look at these issues, we have Francesca Rispoli, who's from the National Board of Libera, and she's going to present the history of Libera and the impact of its work in Italy, and as well as globally, focusing again on this concept of social reuse. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, I have a presentation. I try to. Okay. So I will talk about our experience in Italy and also abroad. Libera is an NGO that is born in 1995 in Italy after the murder of the judge Giovanni Falcone and the judge Paolo Borsellino, and is born to launching a popular petition to collect 1 million signatures to allocate confiscated assets. From that public initiative that we have in 1994 and 1995 became the new law for confiscating assets in Italy. This is our nowadays presence all around the country. You can see our coordination and territorial presidium all over the Italy, but our work is organized in some activity, first of all with school and training, also memory with the family of victims, justice in the process, social use of confiscated assets, and international. About international, I want to underline that we have an internal activity about our training on mafia, international corruption, but overall an external activity to create networking with other NGOs that all around the world work on these topics. And so these are our international networks. The first one is our newborn, it's called Plus or Place, and is in Africa. Then we have ALAS, America Latina Alternativa Social, and the third one is Chance, that is our European network. Here you can see the website of Chance, where you can find some in-depth material about confiscated assets, because now I have just a few minutes, so I will go very quickly. Our legislation in Italy is a very strong legislation, anti-mafia legislation, but I want to underline that is our legislation born every day, a day after a murder, after a massacre, after as a reaction of the community. And so here you can see the different law and the different steps. In red, you can see the 1996 law, that is that one that I was talking about, promoted by Libera. Which is the procedure, step by step, in Italy to arrive to the social reuse. The first one is the seizure, that is a precautionary and a temporary measure. Then we have the confiscation of first degree, and then the confiscation of second degree. That is the last element of the process. After the confiscation of second degree, we have the destination. And here we have two possibilities. The first one is the reuse directly by the state for institutional purpose. And the second one is the possibility to allocate the confiscated asset to the local authorities. Then the local authorities can use the good for institutional purpose, or can give the assets to no-profit association and so on. And then we arrive at the end of the process with the assignment. But nowadays we talk in particular about the reuse project and the cooperative that we can see. Which numbers about this story in Italy? Here you can see our map. This is a map that we update year by year. The 7th of March is the anniversary of our law, and year by year we update this map to see how many subjects all over the country reuse these confiscated assets. Around 1,000 in today. 1,000, that the 50% you can see are association, but we also have a foundation, we have churches, also schools. So a lot of type of subject take these confiscated assets. I just show you very briefly 3 examples. The first one is the social cooperative Placido Rizzotto Libera Terra, that is an example that came from Sicily, at the south of Palermo, Corleone. Here we have a cooperative that have turned 20 years, that manage 250 hectares of confiscated land, a very important property. Here we can do pasta, wine, oil, and so on. And this cooperative is named to the young secretary of the Chamber of Labor, Placido Rizzotto, that is murdered there to protect the worker of that land. The second example is in the north of Italy. We have the Pizzeria Fiore, Cucina in Libertà. In this case, we are nearby Milano, in Lecco. The asset was about 'ndrangheta boss, Franco Coco Trovato. And in this case, I want to underline that the particular is this asset before was a pizzeria, and now is a pizzeria. So the same utilization, but a very different values, as you can see, with placement with people with disadvantages. So here, economic and no-profit sector together with the same subject of before. The third one is Calcestruzzi e Ricina Libera in Sicily again, but in another provinces. Here we are nearby Trapani. And this is a company of concretes. And in this case, the particular is that we join a cooperative with 6 former employees of the company. So the employee before take the company and gave another leave to this experience. At the UN level, already mentioned, we have the European directive that born also thanks to an advocacy action that our European network carry on in Europe. Before Chance, we have another network that is called the FLAIR, that with a very important advocacy action, we arrived to the directive that I know maybe everybody here know. Here I just show you three our project in Europe. The first one is Goods Monitoring Europe, that is a project to map the direct and indirect public and social reuse of confiscated assets in Europe. Also to create a civic monitoring model and activate the civic plan and paths in Europe for urban regeneration and community space. The second one is Twist, that is carrying on nowadays in Albania, to empower the increase of social reuse of confiscated assets from organized crime. Maybe after someone else talk about the Albania experience. And the last is this project in which we cooperate with the OSCE, already mentioned by the director, in the southeast of Europe. In this case, we, in particular, we promote three priority actions. The first one is the participation in workshop, also to boost the relationship between civil society organization and the national institution and national agency. The second action is organize and participate in training courses in the southeast of Europe about the social reuse of confiscated assets, also to develop different model and different step of this type of social reuse. And the third and the last is conduct an awareness-raising campaigns, also using communication tools like video, publication, and also them testing the product arriving from Sicily, for example. Just to finish my presentation, I want to underline that we are trying also with the OSCE to develop and spread campaigns to raise knowledge and consciousness on the negative effect of organized crime and corruption on society, and how the social reuse can strengthen the cultural lawfulness. Because for us, in our perspective, the social reuse is the perfect synthesis of these four dimensions. The first one is the repressive and judicial dimension. The second one is the policy, and then the economic, as we see, and the social and educational one. So with the confiscated asset and the public and social reuse, we can generate values and value. The values like solidarity, welcoming, accompanying, listening, and the value like economy, work, and also development for the territory. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview and for Libera's partnership with the OSCE. Behind, transforming restaurants and companies into new businesses and new initiatives is a lot of work in terms of policy and partnership. And so again, thank you to Libera for actually creating these networks to try to work these issues out among the different stakeholders and parties. Continuing to think about these issues and the importance, and I hope for many of you here, if you're from civil society today, as we think about issues of victims' rights and corruption, which is obviously a big topic for civil society, that social reuse and sort of public return is a collective form of remedy. So thinking about how to, I think, invest in these kinds of concepts is very important. So we're next going to hear from Fatjona Medini, who is the director of the Southeastern Europe Observatory at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And her presentation is going to focus on the important role of social reuse of confiscated assets in terms of crime prevention, but also this concept of building resilient communities. So welcome, Fatjona.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be here today with you. Can you hear me? Okay, I think this is working. It is a real pleasure to be here today with you and share our work and experience against organized crime and corruptions and efforts to create resilience in the vulnerable communities throughout Southeastern Europe. Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, a leading organization of civil society in the field of crime fighting, started its journey 10 years ago. In 2018, during the London summit of the Berlin process, Global Initiative was entrusted with the creation of the Observatory of Illicit Economies in the Southeastern Europe that I have the pleasure of representing today. Our observatory is present in Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. But we also conduct research and follow the criminal trends in neighboring countries such Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. The key functions of our work in this region are research and analysis. We publish regional research reports, policy papers, and more on organized crime and corruption. We also discuss and debate with all the relevant actors, including the governments in the region, pushing so for the research to turn into policy. Also, most importantly, through Global Initiative Resilience Fund, our Southeastern European Observatory is supporting local society organizations to build the resilience against organized crime and corruption. This third component of our work, which is building resilience in local community, has an important value. This is because we are convinced that we could not bring the desired change in society if we don't strengthen the local response against organized crime and corruption. Since the Resilience Fund was launched 3 years ago, we have been able to support in the Western Balkan region over 40 projects of 32 organizations. It is of crucial importance to support civil society in the region to tackle organized crime. Traditionally, in fact, the fight against organized crime in the Western Balkan has been seen as an issue that belongs to the police and other state institutions, and not an issue that civil society could deal with. In fact, this assumption is not true. Civil society could play an important role in the fight against organized crime, especially when it comes to prevention. During our work, we have seen the efforts of civil society in Albania, for example, to prevent the engagement of youngsters in cannabis cultivation. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, civil society have given an important contribution to tackle football hooliganism. In Serbia, they have helped tens of youngsters to integrate into the work market after leaving jail. In Kosovo, civil society has been very active in raising awareness against human trafficking, and in North Macedonia against environmental crimes. In Montenegro, civil society has trained those attending the Sailors Academy to cultivate a culture of integrity and to stay away from drug trafficking. However, although the important role that civil society has and could play, it is clear that the grassroots organizations, especially in this region, are very often underfunded and in many cases reluctant to tackle issues related to crime and corruption because of sensitivities and the risk that they pose. So it is important to put more efforts in those directions and create more possibilities for empowering them. One solution, of course, is to help these organizations through confiscated assets. They could benefit indirectly through grants created from the selling of assets, or directly by using the assets confiscated themselves. There are many benefits in doing so. First, it could remove some of the financial stress that organizations face in terms of paying rent for their office or the salaries of their staff. In the case of the direct use of confiscated assets, organizations could also be free to develop as well business skills and use facilities to support their activities. Second, confiscated mansions or other spaces could also be used as center for youth activities and collaborative workspaces. Across the region, especially in the small centers, what we have seen is the lack of centers where young people could get together, spend quality time, learn and work. On the other hand, the symbolic and psychological effects of civil society reusing the assets that before belonged to criminals and those corrupted, it is of significant importance. Especially in the small communities across the Western Balkans, there are many people these people, like those criminals and corrupted, are often seen and perceived as important and powerful. And the process of taking away their properties and giving them to the public, it is a move that not only demonstrates their weakness, but also make young people think about the repercussions of a life in crime. Last but not least, the engagement of organizations in the process of reuse of confiscated assets build bridges and collaboration in between civil society and state institutions. And together they could share challenges and experience in the fight against organized crime and corruption. However, the social reuse of assets is not an easy task, as we all know in this room, both in terms of legislation and implementation. And Western Balkan countries need to do more in this regard. When it comes to legislation, 5 countries in the region have in place the right legislation that enables civil society to reuse assets. The only exception is Kosovo, where the law does not envisage social reuse, and assets are used by the government only for compensation of injured parties. On the other hand, despite the law in place, countries like Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina have not recorded yet a single case of social reuse of assets. And in North Macedonia, only minor efforts have been undertaken in this regard. Good examples, however, come from Albania and Serbia. In both countries, civil society organizations have indirectly and directly benefited from confiscated assets. Specific symbolic properties of criminals and those corrupted have been given for use to the civil society organization. In Albania, civil society is now waiting to benefit from confiscated agricultural land as well, as the example from Libera was mentioned. So organizations could use this land in the best interest of their communities. In a nutshell, there is a lot to be done in this regard, but there are also very good examples. And I hope from the institutions across the Western Balkans, it also will be some willingness to do more in the near future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for sharing again the experience and also thinking about social reuse, not only in terms of confiscated assets. Is this on? No, it's not on. I'm a teacher, so I speak loudly. But going towards, as you heard from Libera, this idea of handing over a business or a building. But the other piece is to actually liquidate the assets and then to use them for new purposes. And so you've heard about that from Fationa from the Global Initiative and the projects that they have been focusing on as part of social resilience. We'll now turn to more the technical things, which is that to have assets to give away, you actually have to have a mechanism for recovery and then for decisions about end use, and that's also incredibly difficult. So as we make it all sound so easy in this panel today, we have to realize that there are lots and lots of policy dilemmas and reforms that are needed to get us to the place we want to be when we see people like Fationa or Francesca speaking about what's possible. So our next speaker is Gretta Fenner, the Managing Director of the Basel Institute on Governance, who's going to talk about international asset return and the issue of end use in terms of who decides and really how can you make this possible. So welcome, Gretta.
Thank you. We're just very COVID compliant, sharing the same microphone. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me, Anita, and everyone at OSCE to this panel. It's a topic that, in many ways, I feel like I've talked about it so many times, but I do hope that we're, and you know, the examples we heard, certainly at the domestic level, when it comes to social reuse of recovered assets, I think we have some good examples that are starting to show. I'm going to focus primarily on the international asset return and the end use of internationally recovered assets because they present different challenges. And I think, you know, the domestic situation and the international one can certainly learn from each other. I'm not necessarily going to go into the pre-return, but we have to be understanding that there is years and years and years of work going into actually being in the situation where you can return and, you know, repurpose stolen assets. So perhaps that's just one point I want to make is about expectation management when it comes to international recovery. we always think these billions are going to come back tomorrow, and they are not. And I think it's important that we're honest about that. We want to make improvements in this regard, but we have to be honest about it, because otherwise disappointments will be huge when ultimately we have a couple of cases, important ones, and it's just 1 or 2 millions. They're still very valuable. But I think it's important that we understand that component. And I also want to maybe add one more point in relation to asset recovery. Yes, we want asset recovery to result in assets being returned to the victim countries and being put to their usually original purpose of benefiting social and economic development. But there is a whole different dimension to the work of asset recovery, because it starts, detection, investigation, and prosecution, adjudication, international cooperation. There's a whole different dimension that we also benefit from if we do have a successful asset recovery case, in fact, even in unsuccessful asset recovery cases, and that is building capacity within the criminal justice chain. So we got to keep both sides, I think, in sight, and one of the benefits of asset recovery is also just strengthening the criminal justice system. But I'll come back to return and hopefully the cases where we can actually repurpose stolen assets. And I just want to take us very briefly through the history of this debate, which started at the time when the UN Convention Against Corruption was negotiated. And suffice to say that for anyone who's read the convention, you would have realized that there is a significant absence of the topic of asset return. There is one line really that talks about the possibility of maybe entering into agreements between requesting and requested states, but that's all. And we should not forget that, because almost 20 years later, the topic's still a delicate topic. So the reason why it wasn't in the convention is because nobody really, there was no common ground, and it was a topic that almost made the negotiations around the UN Convention explode and fail. So we should really not forget it's not an easy topic at all when it comes internationally. We did start a dialogue almost 10 years after the entry, or the signature, the original signature of the convention. It took 10 years for a couple of people to dare to bring the topic up again, and I was involved in organizing this event in 2013. I can tell you I didn't make a lot of friends, including in the key international organizations. They would rather not attend that discussion because they knew of the political delicacy and sensitivities. We went ahead anyway, and it was a good discussion, but I would say there's maybe 2 consensuses only that we got to, but they were important ones. And the first one, and the one I'll mention, is that those 40 experts from the global north, the global south, etc., they agreed that there is a shared interest in returning stolen assets, in the sense that both countries have to win from returning those assets in a meaningful way. And that was, frankly speaking, a big step back in 2013. We moved on, and the UNODC then actually did decide that it was probably the right moment to pick up the topic in 2014. And your example of the pizzeria made me think of that event in 2014 in Reggio Calabria in southern Italy, which is known for relatively high levels of organized crime, I guess still, certainly back then. And we wish we had a pizzeria like that, because the whole conference of 150 people had to eat at the same place every single time over the 3 days, because the organizers said it was the only restaurant open during that time in the region that wasn't paying its dues to the organized criminal networks. And we wish we had a Libera pizzeria back then, so we would have all felt really good about it. But anyways, it just made me realize, that pizzeria would have come healthy. I think basically the one topic, and there are many, that I want to address is the issue of sovereignty, because that is where there is so much politicization in international asset recovery cases. And I want to stress that the politicization, when you talk to the technical experts, it's usually not there. It's usually quite a pragmatic approach. Okay, we're getting extra money, let's make something good out of that, or sort of good, right? The politicization about how dare you tell us how we are supposed to use our money, it's our money, your financial center was hiding it for us, and that whole debate, the international sovereignty debate, is actually only a political debate. At the technical level, you find people who are very pragmatic and who say, no, we need to just, this is good money, let's make good use of it. Also, on the sovereignty issue, typically we would always think that let me be very provocative here, right? The poor countries from the global south are the ones who are in a weak position because the nasty countries from the global north dictate what they should do with the money. And that may well be the case in some cases. But there is sometimes a reversal of that sovereignty issue whereby a financial center, which may be a very small financial center with very little political clout, wishes to do the right thing and give the money back and make sure that the money is used for meaningful purposes, and the recipient country actually politically is a lot more powerful internationally and ultimately takes the money and does what it wants. So I'm bringing these two things because the whole debate of sovereignty when it comes to international asset recovery is not as black and white and straightforward as we would normally like to think. Now, in terms of some of the, and then the discussion continued and we had more meetings and more papers and GFAR principles and ADIS principles and so on. Drawing from all these debates that I've accompanied for many years, I just want to recommend that A, we try to get over that sovereignty debate and recognize once again it's in the mutual interest that this money goes back in a meaningful, transparent way. And secondly, I want to share some thoughts that we've gathered in this context, when considerations for you to take into account when you determine the end use of the returned assets. First of all, simple, no size fits all. There's always people who say, we get some money back and we want to do it like in Kazakhstan. Or we want to do it back like in Nigeria. Well, actually, it really depends. Are we talking about 1 million? Are we talking about 150 million? Are we talking about 2 billion? You know, so consider what's meaningful and don't just copy a model. Consider the expectations of your citizens, but be careful when you manage the expectations of your citizens. Don't go out there and say you'll all see this money coming back. Communicate clearly where you're going to put the money and listen to the citizens and listen where they will feel the greatest impact. Often what's really helpful and what makes the strongest message to citizens and people is that you consider the origin of the money. So where was it stolen from? Was it stolen in a procurement in the electricity sector, for example? Well, if it was, think about could we reinvest the money into sustainable energy development, for example? If it was stolen from a particular region, think about a project that supports that region. And here we're already coming to the debate of victims, of course, because individual standing of victims, we're not very well advanced. And I'm not even sure that this is the most important debate we should have, but the collective reparation of victims that have suffered from corruption is one that we can really, really pick up when we talk about the end use. So that's one area where you can, I think, really symbolize the harm that corruption does, and you can symbolize the benefit of anti-corruption and asset recovery. And I think with that, you can really get the support of society also for your overall reform. Two more things that I've seen have always been really well accepted and helped accelerate the fight against corruption beyond one or the other particular asset return. And that is when the money was used to fix the problem on the one hand. So it was used to strengthen corruption prevention, corruption education. It was used to strengthen civil society engagement in anti-corruption. So really connected to the crime. Or, and we have an excellent example of that, for example, with a return from Luxembourg and Switzerland to Peru, in a few old Montesinos cases, where the money is used dedicated to strengthening the criminal justice system geared toward asset recovery, with the idea that here we have 30 million going back to Peru. What's the best thing we can do? We strengthen the asset recovery institutions, because when they're strengthened, they can multiply that success. And they have. And in Peru, we see one case after the other of confiscation, international, domestic. So by using 30 million in a very smart way, you can really recover a lot more money. I think I would just like to end with one topic, which is kind of on topic, sort of. Thank you, Anita, for your tolerance. We're constantly still talking about the return of stolen assets, meaning assets that was stolen from a public official, let's say in a country, and then channeled through multiple financial centers, and we find it in a bank account somewhere. And that really needs to go back to the country where it was stolen from. I like to argue that we need to move the asset return debate onto other forms of corruption, and in particular foreign bribery, And I think this conference will hear a lot about the Glencore case and similar cases where a company, and let me take my own country, it's easiest, a Swiss company bribes in Nigeria, has never happened, of course, before. A Swiss company is found guilty in Swiss courts for having bribed in Nigeria, let's say. What does happen with the fine and disgorgement of profits? At the moment, that money stays in Switzerland. And I'm using Switzerland because it's easiest for me, but it really is the case for almost every other country. I don't think that's right. I think at least a large portion of that money needs to go back to Nigeria because that is where the harm was done, where the substandard dam was built, or where the medicine that was purchased never got actually distributed, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you. And I really think, and thankfully I'm seeing movement in this regard, and I think we should all rally behind that movement. So in Switzerland there is a legislative initiative that wants to introduce that. Other countries are considering it as well. I think we really need to rally behind this movement to bring more justice to the people who have actually suffered from corruption. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gretta. And I see even as we move from national to international and the question of end use, we're all thinking about this idea of collective reparation and what it means. And you've just introduced this new piece, which is, of course, when we look at the private actors, what does it mean to think about remedy and reparation in relation to the profits made or the harm caused in the country where the bribe was paid. So thank you for introducing that new dimension. And just want to say that I think that as you were talking about these issues, I think the OSCE, through its project, is really trying to focus on many of the details of this issue of asset recovery cross-border and what it means to return those assets. So thank you. Our last speaker, who I think can help continue this discussion again of the international aspect of this, and then actually present some case studies focusing on Moldova and Nigeria, is Flavia Munteanu, who's the head of international and operational asset recovery policy at the UK Home Office. And so again, she's going to take, I think, some of the things that Gretta's talked about in theory and actually talk about what it looks like in practice. So welcome, Flavia.
Can you hear me? I think this works. Morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here and listening to what's been a fascinating panel so far. Just before I go into the case studies, I think it'd be quite interesting to unpack some of the concepts around social reuse. So I'll speak from my perspective as somebody attending government and intergovernmental meetings, such as UN meetings, and obviously you all know that the social return and the return of assets and the restitution happens by using the UN Convention Against Corruption as a legal basis. Now, what's interesting is when the UN has various working groups on asset recovery, we don't tend to really think or talk about social reuse in such a transparent manner. There's a lot of discussion about sovereignty, transparency, accountability, but social reuse as a concept doesn't really have that mandatory legal basis in multilateral conventions. So we identified this gap in the UK government and thought, well, what can we do when we recover assets and where we want to return them? Because we don't want those assets to be, frankly, re-corrupted. So we identified mechanisms to do that and agreed to an internal policy, which has now been published on the government's website. So you can Google it if you want. It's called the Framework for Accountable and Transparent Asset Returns. And it basically just explains the UK's view on how assets should be returned in a manner that doesn't breach sovereignty, but also is incredibly transparent. So we do this, for example, by engaging in negotiations with the recipient country. I'll give 2 examples in a second, but with Moldova and Nigeria, for example, we engaged in negotiations around the return of those assets that had been stolen, and then we agreed on a mutually agreeable term or sort of use of assets that were always in the benefit of the people of those countries. Now, what's interesting is we always insist on publishing that the deal or the memorandum, if you like. So we negotiate the agreement of a certain instrument, usually a memorandum, because a treaty takes a very long time. And we publish that MOU on both governments' websites, just again, the interest of transparency, so that people can see in both the recipient country as well as in the UK where the investigation has taken place, exactly how those assets are going to be returned, and why law enforcement spent significant time and resource to ensure that those assets then get recovered and then returned in a way that is in the interest of both countries.
So with that in mind, I'm going to actually go into some case studies. We returned, so last year I think it was £456,000 to the Republic of Moldova. The story is quite an interesting one. So Luka Filat, who was the son of a former Moldovan prime minister who was involved in a big corruption scandal in Moldova, was enjoying a luxury lifestyle in London. This included buying a central London apartment. Actually, he was renting it for £390,000 per year. Now, Moldova is one of the poorest countries in Europe, so it's immediately striking how somebody who's a full-time university student can afford to do this. Secondly, he purchased a high-value Bentley vehicle upon arrival in London, and was enjoying. There are various other anecdotes, but in the news there'll be things like, he would buy £1,000 vodka bottles for his friends, and the police suddenly just saw all these expenses and went, that's a little bit dodgy. So in a nutshell, there was an investigation on the basis that these transactions were looking quite suspicious, to say the least, and due to the fact that Luka Filat hadn't declared any income in the UK, and there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that this money could be explainable in any way, the inference that the judge made and the National Crime Agency who started the investigation was that the funds in the account were the proceeds of money laundering. So there were large sums of cash that were paid in 3 bank accounts, including a £100,000 payment in a 3-day period. So again, really strange. And he appealed, but the UK Crown Court actually completely rejected and dismissed the appeal. So what happened is we then recovered the funds, 456,000, and we said to the Moldovans, we'd very much like to return the full amount to you under UNCAC provisions, Article 57. And the government of Moldova entered into quite open discussions with the UK government and said, we'd like to use these funds in a transparent manner in the interest of the people of Moldova, which is exactly the same narrative that the Home Office had, so the ministry that I work for. So we agreed to put the funds in the interest of the people by utilising them for social care assistance projects. And there was a period of negotiation with the British Embassy, but also the respective ministry in Moldova. And then there was a very public signing ceremony, and we ultimately transferred the funds. And the Memorandum of Understanding is now visible on both governments' websites. What we also insist on is that civil society actually monitors the implementation and the return, so that we can actually see that the money has been put to good use, which in Moldova it successfully has. The second example I'll talk about is a Nigeria return. Again, some people in this room might be familiar with this, but I'll give the narrative. James Ibori is a former official in Nigeria. He was governor of the Delta State, and he stole significant state assets and transferred many of them from Nigeria to the UK, as well as other countries. And in the sort of mid-2000s, the National Crime Agency, so one of our law enforcement bodies, began an investigation into Mr. Ibori, and basically proved on the balance of probabilities that there were assets that belonged to him, significant assets that had been the proceeds of crime, and specifically fraud, but also other forms of corruption that would fall under the UN Convention Against Corruption remit. So there was a lot of back and forth between the UK authorities and Dubai in 2011, I believe, where the UK asked the authorities in Dubai to be extradited so that he could be trialed in a UK court. In February 2012, actually, James Ibori then pleaded guilty to money laundering, conspiracy to defraud, forgery, and then sentenced to 13 years in prison. But also some of his associates and family received similar sentences for similar offences and also sent to prison. I think a couple of years later then, Mr. Ibori appealed against that conviction by alleging that one of the British police officers who investigated him had actually taken bribes. Obviously, the appeal was dismissed by the Court of Appeal in 2018, and Mr. Ibori was deported to Nigeria and released from prison in the UK in 2016. All this actually amounted to a recovery of 4.2 million, which was recovered in the UK. And then, very similarly to how we did it with Moldova, we engaged in negotiations with the Nigerian government because we determined that it's the people of Nigeria who are the fundamental victims of the crimes committed by James Ibori. And so the funds were actually merged with a further 320
million, which were recovered by the US, and they went into the same pot in Nigeria to support the development of major infrastructure projects. Specifically, I think it's a bridge that connects the west and the northern and the east part of Nigeria. So it's a vast area covering several kilometers with millions of the country's population that would benefit from these new infrastructures. And again, in the same sort of topic, when we talk about sovereignty, the UK government never went out to Nigeria and said, we specifically want to put the funds in X project. It's actually the Nigerian government who said to the UK, we would like to use the funds in this way. Our insistence is very much on transparency and accountability, but we always give full flexibility to the government, which is the recipient, to decide on whichever project they want to use the money on, as long as it is transparent. And also, again, the Memorandum of Understanding and the civil society monitoring provisions applied, and they can be found on the websites of both the recipient government and the UK government. So those are the two case studies. Just to kind of give an example, there are multiple other returns that are either pending or ongoing, and I think the discussion that Greta had mentioned around foreign bribery is also something that we're very much alive to in the UK government and thinking about. But I'll end with this and happy to take any questions.
Thank you all, and I think what you're seeing from all of our speakers is progress and innovation in a place where we've been having debates about these issues for a long time around where should the assets go and how to manage them. We have time now actually for questions, so I have questions for the panelists but would rather hear. So again, if we can, and I'm not sure, will there be mics roving or how should we do this? I'm looking at our technical team in the back. So yeah, we'll have the gentleman in the back, but we're just getting you a microphone. Thank you. So we have the gentleman in the back, and then we had another person on this side, and okay. So we'll take three, and then go back to the panel.
Thank you very much. First, I want to introduce my name is David Ogolo. I'm the Executive Director of African Network for Environment and Economic Justice based in Nigeria. My question goes to one to Greta and then our friend from UK Home Office. First, I want to thank Greta for again bringing the issue of asset return to the issue of bribery and the need to compensate the victim. But I'd like to see the whole issue of victim is something that I would like you to dwell on. How, when the bribery happens, who decides who is the victim? Because issue of power comes to play very clearly. If you look at the recent case of Nigeria, when Nigeria filed for the case of victim in the Glencoe case in UK, you can see how the court case ended. That is something I would like you to, again, put an explanation around the issue of power, the issue where court cases are taken, because you spoke on the issue of sovereignty, because it's a very critical issue in the conversations around bribery. Then my question also goes to our friend from the UK. You know, this is another, we just came back from Nairobi where we were discussing the issue of asset recovery and using it for sustainable development. And it is gradually moving towards technical direction. The issue of asset return and social reuse is the issue of justice. It's the issue of power. And so don't take that away. And gradually we're moving all the conversations around for civil society participation, the issue of procurement, you know, the case of Nigeria you presented, the UK government returned Ibori asset to Nigeria, but there wasn't any conversation with the victim. The money was returned to Nigeria, used by the major tribes in Nigeria, and for the purpose of the major tribe. The money was stolen from the poor people of Delta State. I'm from Delta State. So, issue of participation and transparency and engagement with the victim is very important. The UK government ignored the people of Delta State. Ibori, the governor of Delta State, stole the money from Delta State. Delta State is a state in Nigeria. So there was lack of transparency and accountability in that entire process. And the people of Delta State were denied the resources. And the resources was put in a major pot in Nigeria that has nothing to do with the victim in Nigeria. And when we raised this issue before the British government, we were ignored. So that's why I said this whole issue around asset return and reuse is issue of power. The power still remains with those who decide where the money goes and where it plays out. So when we come to international conferences and say they are bad, good practices, we're not being honest in analysis about it. So the Ibori return to Nigeria, was the victim consulted? That is a question I would like to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. And we may actually want to also hear from our civil society colleagues as well, because they may have perspectives on these issues of victims and who speaks for them in the process. We have a second question here. Was there someone in this, in the front row? Yes, if you could wait for the mic because we're streaming, apologies, and then the gentleman over on the other side afterwards.
Thank you. I'm Jerzy Vurma from IDM Albania. I had many questions at the beginning of the panel, but thanks to excellent presentations, most of them just got deleted, so I remained with only 3 of them.
Well, I think we're going to have to ask for perhaps one question. Just
2?
Okay, 2. So 2.
Okay. So then I'm going to. Okay. Use of. I was wondering whether there are any experiences or perhaps thoughts, ideas to reuse the confiscated assets, either for the attraction of the foreign direct investments. That's one of the things that poor regions and countries really need, or to involve even religious communities in our countries. Maybe for those that don't know, Albania has confiscated many properties from the religious communities during communist times that we still owe to restitute to them. So maybe can we find some way to, through providing them some of the confiscated assets to get 2 things done. Last questions, considering that organized crime operates across borders and regions, is there room for an international body assisting the reuse and management of confiscated assets? So perhaps some of building something on the experience that you were presenting on the British experience with getting back the confiscated assets to Moldova or Nigeria or other countries. And even more, considering the fact that civil society is already doing that through joint cooperations, such as a project that you were mentioning in Albania. Even media is doing that through joint investigations of criminal assets. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And no, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I see in the back of the room, we'll do one more round after this.
I want to thank the panel for these very interesting presentations on a subject which hasn't got much light in the topic of asset recovery. You called it the last mile, and that's when all the long work has been completed. I work for the government of Liechtenstein. I'm the Attorney General there, and I have worked for 23 years on asset recovery. And my observation is that there are more and more cases that are being completed, small cases, medium cases, and only the very big cases often get public. So I think that's very good news, and in more cases, assets are being returned. Now, in the ideal case, we should just have to follow UNCAC, Article 57, which says that the assets shall be returned, full stop. Gretta explained how this came about. It was a very sensitive topic in Vienna. When UNCAC was negotiated, there was talk about the unconditional return of assets. that was a big demand. And only para 5 of Article 57 allows, in some very soft language, the conclusion of agreements. But for those, you need both sides to be ready for such an agreement. And that's not always the case. And we had a very large asset return case where after 8 years of litigation, we forfeited in total over 300 million of assets. And when those assets were to be returned to the victim country, this victim country demanded the unconditional return of those assets. We were worried that the assets would go back into possibly the wrong channels. We tried to lean on the World Bank. The World Bank was trying to assist us, but in the end didn't get a mandate from that country. And so in the end, we transferred the assets to an account of their country with the Bank of International Settlement in Basel. And about a year later, I read in the press that supposedly the money was used to buy weapons in that country. So for the country that confiscates the assets, it's the means are limited what you can do if the victim country demands the unconditional return of assets. And it's a very sensitive issue, as Gretta said, because all those arguments came up. You are the country that helped hide the money in the first place, and now you want to talk to us how we should use the money. Also, I have one point, and I'd like to hear a comment from you. When the STAR initiative discussed best practices of asset recovery, I remember it was a big topic whether there should be allocation of those assets. And the experts of the World Bank, they strongly argued against it. They said in good governance, government money should go into one big coffer, and then the priorities of use must be made by the democratically elected parliament and government, whether it's health or education or transport. What are the priorities in good governance should be decided on that way, and allocation and making boxes can create wrong incentives. And I personally think it certainly can create wrong incentives if it's allocated to law enforcement. If the incentive to build cases to forfeit and to freeze assets is urged too much by this, then that can cause a wrong incentive. I'd like to hear a comment. I know from one Asian jurisdiction where there was a law for a while that actually the officers involved in a raid confiscating assets stemming from drug trafficking, they personally got a share of 10% of the assets. And I think that those kind of allocations certainly create wrong incentives. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think in the interest of time,
We have one question in the back, so perhaps we'll take that and then go back to our panel.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Hadi from Partnership for Transparency. I have a question for the colleague, Ms. Flavia from the UK Home Office. In your case study on Moldova, you said you're involving CSOs in the monitoring of the implementation of those funds. I'm wondering if you could share some information on how that actually works. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just recap, and then we'll go back to the panel. I think all of our experts can speak about this issue of, again, imbalance of power and the issue of victims, right? And sort of who can speak for them and the issues of the interests of government that may or may not represent communities and people who have been harmed. So we'd like to hear from all the panelists on that. I think for Flavia And Francesca, there are just questions about issues of where can assets be used. There was a question about can they be used for things like foreign direct investment? Can they be used to give to religious communities? So your thoughts on kind of the end use of the assets in these different ways. And then 2 other questions. Should there be an international body that helps monitor asset return? Is there room for that? Issues of law enforcement, and actually the OSCE guide, good practice guide that is coming out, does suggest that some assets that are confiscated can be used to maintain law enforcement, but also asset management, that you do need some, I think, investment in the government enforcement mechanisms. But I guess the question is, does that create a bad incentive to just for law enforcement? And finally, the last question of civil society monitoring. So a lot of things to touch upon. So Gretta, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go back in reverse order.
Thanks very much. It's good to see many familiar faces, David back there, and of course Robert. And thanks for the questions. I think, David, on your question with the victims, I think that's really the critical issue which is being discussed now in many forums. And I think there is the Glencore case shows that you have victims that can be companies, actually, or employees from the health sector, for example, that were affected. It can be the entire region. For me, the question is the following. There's, in a way, two ways of going about it. We find a so-called universal definition for victims, or a framework for determining who the victims are. We could probably find that. It might take 10 years to negotiate, but we could give it a shot. Or ultimately that we have a framework to determine who the victims are but related to specific cases, because I really don't think there is a generic definition that would apply. Maybe a framework for decision making that could be internationally accepted in terms of how do you identify and determine the victims. But again, I think we probably are not best served, that's my personal opinion, to try to find an individual victim compensation, but to actually have to find a circle of victims in a more collective sense. But this is just sort of my take on what I think is feasible and realistic. And obviously defining who the victims are should involve more than just 2 government officials talking to each other, but should involve conversation with society. Who really know who the victims are. I think in terms of I'm not even sure I want to go into the question of should there be an international body, because I think there is a bunch of proposals around, including from African organizations, for example, who've suggested the establishment of an escrow account with the African Union or African Development Bank, where frozen assets should be held until a case is determined. If it's for the management of frozen assets in international asset recovery cases, I'm quite skeptical, because I really don't see what value that adds in terms of the quality of the management, especially when we talk about money on a bank. Why would that be better served in an escrow account than in an international bank that doesn't benefit from having the money but needs to look after it, or the treasury of the country that's frozen it, and so on. So I'm a little bit skeptical, but I think we need to really, really boost the management capacity of frozen assets, because, and I think that hasn't been mentioned, and I'll leave it at that with my last comment. I see a lot of countries now making progress in freezing assets, and freezing assets are often Range Rovers, other fancy cars, houses, and so on. And I see all these cars rotting in the car yards of anti-corruption enforcement agencies. And I can already tell you that they will not win all these cases. They will lose quite a few. And then the state is going to be liable for paying for these damages. So let's make sure that we don't forget about whether we are actually capable of managing certain assets before we freeze them, or what it means freezing them, because you can actually leave the car with the owner. He can't sell it, but he needs to pay for the maintenance. So that's just a small example. But when we talk about these big international mechanisms, I actually think we would be better off giving countries the capacity to manage it themselves and become more autonomous rather than dependent yet again from an international negotiated mechanism. Thank you.
And I'll just say again that this asset management network has been very, very important, because these issues that seem so mundane of managing yards of cars are precisely the kinds of things that these poor managers have to deal with, and the challenges around them. So thank you for raising those issues. Flavia, back to you.
So on the question of who is the victim, I think it's an enormously complicated question, not least because so I'll just give an example from the UK's perspective, but when the Home Office, so my department, receives the funds, we've got all the specifics of the case and then the final court judgment, which doesn't actually identify the victim in many cases. There might not even be a compensation provision in the judicial process for victims, so that's the law enforcement process, and the court may decide that there's no compensation for victims whatsoever. And then it comes to us to determine under UNCAC and international mechanisms whether we should be returning any funds or not. Now, that's a very different mechanism to the judicial process. And so it is within the government's remit to determine that the people of a country have suffered harm without actually establishing who the victim is specifically. I think it links to the question of the gentleman who asked about the Ibori funds and why the funds didn't go to the Delta region as opposed to being invested in an infrastructure project. Again, from a government's perspective, we wouldn't be mandating how the funds go back. It is in both governments' interest to come to a mutually agreeable consensus and negotiate, and actually it becomes incredibly difficult for one side to insist on priorities that aren't reflected in the other sides in the discussions. Now, from my perspective as a policymaker, I don't see any reason why the funds wouldn't go directly towards a region from which the funds were originally corrupted. But again, that has to be something that we agree with the recipient government. Otherwise, we're unable to return the funds and the whole process stalls. So, in a sense, it's better to return funds in a way that benefits all of the people of, for example, Nigeria, than return no funds at all. But I appreciate there are concerns with the way in which those funds were returned from the Nigerian people's perspective. And I also appreciate those concerns, frankly, but as I say, it's better to return than not to return at all. Then on the question of cooperation with civil society, so in Moldova, we partnered with Keystone Moldova, which was an organization that specifically worked with people that had disabilities or people in very social care type community work. And what they did is they then partnered with the Moldovan government to produce a report. It was a quarterly report that was sent to the UK government and to the Moldovan government every couple of months, just to explain the ways in which they saw progress and the ways in which the funds were allocated. But if you want to know more about the specifics of which Keystone partnered with the government at home, you'd have to ask the Moldovan government, I have to say, because they were ultimately the ones that massively collaborated with them on the ground alongside the British Embassy. And finally, on the question of international body to monitor, I think it's a politically sensitive question. We always say that sovereignty and conditionality are very different things. We never want to breach any country's sovereignty, but we want to make sure that the funds go back in a transparent, accountable way, and in a way that doesn't fundamentally re-corrupt the assets. So I think having an international body comes with certain risks and also certain benefits, but it's probably a discussion that's placed in a better context multilaterally, for example, to take forward.
Thank you. I answered the question about the religion communities. So we have a lot of experience in Italy of reuse from religion communities. Also because in Italy we have some part of the country, especially in the south, but not only in the south, where the Catholic churches every day do the difference in giving an opportunity to young to stay in a safe space, to learn, play, and stay together, and not in the streets, because very often could happen that the organized crime offered to them the possibility to become one of them on the streets. And so the church in this case is a prevention tool. In the map that I show you, you could see that we have 74 experiences on 1,000, so is more than the 7% of experience mapped from us. So it's a very important experience.
In fact, I wanted to add something when it comes to religious community, because without any doubt they have a big role in prevention of crime. And of course they have to be considered also as beneficiaries of these confiscated assets. And in fact, as Francesca also said, there are many organizations in Italy that they are connected with Catholic Church, that they work in that direction. And also they have assisted, for example, in other countries in the region and partnered with other organizations of civil society to do so and to help. Italy has this model like already figured out, but in the Balkans we don't see any progress in that regard. But this is a good thing to consider. On the other hand, when it comes the question of the foreign investors to use the assets confiscated, I think this is a little bit tricky because there's always this sensibility that comes with confiscated assets. So it's not easy, like, I mean, because on the back of the mind of some people still, they might think that these assets belong to them. But what good example I can bring, for example, is from Albania, where Italian civil society organizations, they are using assets that are confiscated in Albania, so providing services for Albanian citizens. So I think when it comes to civil society organization, it can be more exchange in that matter. And I just want to touch a little bit upon the issue, who are the victims. I mean, they can vary from case to case, of course. And in special cases where some victims come forward, I think that might be room for legal provision. So some of the money from the confiscated assets of that certain criminal group, let's say, could also go directly to the victims. When we have cases of corruption and corrupted officials, of course, the victims are all the citizens of that country, and so in this regard, still this is different. But I think when it comes, some classification, it also might be done. So, for example, when we confiscate the assets of criminal groups that has been active in the drug trafficking, they might be the asset might go to the organizations that they work on drug addiction, and so this might be a way how the victims can benefit.
Please join me in thanking all of our panelists. Many cross-cutting issues that we've heard about from them today, and hopefully this conversation will continue. Thank you.